here with Charles Duhigg, author of The Power of Habit. Thanks for coming to talk to us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So how did you get interested in the power of habit as a subject?
So about almost a decade ago, I'm a reporter for the New York Times right now, and I was a correspondent in Iraq. And I thought it would be very interesting to go to Iraq because I wanted to see what it was like to be in a war zone. And it turns out the best thing you can do in a war zone is try and find some place where you won't get shot at. So I heard about this army major who was doing an experiment about an hour south of Baghdad on a base near a city named Kufa that was on a base, so I wouldn't get shot at. Where his job was to stop riots from happening. And so I went down and talked to this guy and asked him how he had done it. What he said was that he had gone to the mayor and he had asked the mayor to remove all the food vendors from the plazas, and that this had stopped all of the riots from happening. And I asked him why, and he said, well, you know, riots build up over time, and what happened was that we've noticed that about 5:30 people would start getting hungry and they would eat from the food vendors and stick around and a riot would break out. So we got rid of the food vendors and everyone would go home, and the riots just never materialized, which I thought was really interesting. And I asked him how he knew that this would happen. He said the military is basically this huge habit experiment. Everything he'd learned in the military was about habit formation. And once you have that lens, you can see habits all around you. And so I got really fascinated, and I came home and started learning everything I could.
And habits, I always think of people who have really good habits as being sort of advanced, but it doesn't, it's almost, habits come from like sort of the lizard mind, right? It's the basal ganglia.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So most of what we do during our days, when we make decisions, it happens in our prefrontal cortex, the most evolutionary recent part of our brains. When a habit forms, and about 40% of our daily activities are habits, according to studies, that neural activity moves from the prefrontal cortex into the basal ganglia, one of the oldest parts of the brain, where essentially it doesn't feel like you make decisions at all. That's why habits feel so compelling, so automatic, is because literally the part of your brain that can make decisions isn't involved in any way.
People are going to want to know, what's the best way to alter bad habits? Do you have an answer for us?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
So what we've learned in the last decade from neurologists has completely transformed our understanding of habits. And what we now know is that there's three components to every habit. There's a cue, which is like a trigger for the behavior to start unfolding, a routine, which is the behavior itself, and then a reward, which is how your brain essentially learns to remember this pattern for the future. What psychologists say is to change habits, focus on the cue and the reward. Most of us think of the behavior, the routine, as the habit, but the levers are the cue and the reward. If you can identify what's triggering that behavior and what reward it's providing, then you can start to diagnose how to change the behavior and remake experiments show any habit whatsoever.
I was interested in the power of belief in helping to change bad habits, I guess, and especially the power of joining a group, I guess, right?
Right.
And helping. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So one of the chapters talks about Tony Dungy, who's this football coach who ended up being one of the most successful coaches in the NFL. And it tells his story alongside the story of Alcoholics Anonymous. Basically, how does AA work and how did it grow? And in both cases, what they found was AA and Tony Dungy had to change people's habits to make them successful. AA, for instance, doesn't really treat the underlying causes of alcoholism. What it does is it gives you new habits to replace drinking habits. But what both Tony Dungy and AA has found is that these new habits only last until there's usually some type of crisis moment, at which point people revert to their old behaviors, unless they genuinely believe that they can change. And the key to creating that belief is to basically try and change within a group, that we learn from other people how to believe in ourselves, and that's the critical difference for habits that stay changed.
All right, so sometimes being part of a group also allows you to look at other people and say, well, I can be better than that person, right?
Right, that's exactly, I mean, one of the things that's really fascinating is when you talk to AA researchers, what they say is two things happen in this group, and this happens in any group, which this is why belief occurs. One is that, you know, people positively reinforce you, they say, hey, way to go, good job. The other is that at some point you're going to be sitting in that room and you're going to look across the table and think to yourself, you know, Joe has been sober for 12 years. And Joe is a moron. I think I'm definitely better than Joe. And that's what's really important, is that habits change because we analyze these cues and rewards, but also because we believe change is possible. And that belief occurs in different ways for different people. And you have to experiment to figure out how that belief can stick in your life.
You're a business reporter at the New York Times.
Right.
What have you learned about institutional habits that you found fascinating?
is the most fascinating thing is that how strong institutional habits are, right? One of the chapters is about Paul O'Neill, who before he became Treasury Secretary, he was the CEO of Alcoa. And he came into the Alcoa, which was the largest aluminum company at the time in the world. And he came in and people thought he was going to focus on profits and efficiency and X and Y and Z. And what he said was, my number one goal is to change worker safety habits. And because he knew that Alcoa had these dysfunctional organizational habits, and that if he could choose one habit, what he called a keystone habit, and begin adjusting it, that it would serve like a chain reaction and change the culture of the entire organization. It would undermine all the other bad habits Alcoa had. And it worked perfectly. Within 2 years, they were the top performing stock in the Dow Jones Industrial Average. But what's most fascinating is just how strong these habits are, and that until someone points them out to you, you usually don't see them.
You're covering Apple now.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about their institutional habits?
Sure.
What makes them Apple?
Sure. And I'm covering Apple for the New York Times in a series that we're doing called The Eye Economy. One of the interesting things about Apple is that Apple, for instance, has a number of organizational habits. One of them being secrecy, right? Apple is famously secretive. And the new CEO, and that secrecy is an asset, a strength for the company, but it's also a drawback, particularly in this day and age when there's problems in overseas factories. A number of Apple employees don't understand what's going on with their own company. So the new CEO, Tim Cook, I think, is trying to change the culture of Apple by changing these organizational habits, in much the same way I think that we write about in the book.
I talk to a lot of authors, most of whom write, for most of whom writing is that's their sole job. You have a full-time, very demanding job, I'm sure. What habits allowed you to write this book and keep your job?
One habit is I have a very understanding wife. So she has good habits. But the other actually is, when I was talking to psychologists, I would always ask them how I could change my own habits. And they emphasize focus on, diagnose the cues, diagnose the rewards. I've actually lost like 30 pounds since I started writing this book, but my work habits have really improved. And I think the reason why is because the more mindful you are of the habits in your life, the easier they are to design. So before, when we were talking about habits existing in the basal ganglia, when you decide to start changing your habits, this kind of almost magical neurological thing happens. We don't really understand why, which is that you begin pulling patterns out of the sort of reptilian part of your brain into the prefrontal cortex. And just doing that for some reason seems to make habits more malleable. When you pay attention to cues and rewards, you seem to start short-circuiting the circuitry that makes them automatic. And then you get to fiddle with it, and it becomes automatic again. So my habits have gotten much better about, like, for instance, being able to get to work immediately, having much more focus instantaneously on the text that I'm looking at, or being able to organize my thoughts and my work. And I think a lot of that is just because I think deliberately about the structure of that habit. And somehow your brain does the rest to make it automatic.
Is there a habit that you still want to gain?
Yes, there's a lot.
You've thought a lot about habits.
Right.
Is there anything left for you to
Actually, one of the biggest things is I have 2 kids, and I don't know if you have kids.
Yeah, young.
So you feel this too.
Yeah.
Like, the thing that's hard about kids is it's so easy to be with them and to mentally check out, right? Because it's not like you need to have a conversation with them while you're sitting there playing. But on the other hand, the whole point of having kids and adding to their lives is to mentally be present. So the biggest habit I'm working on right now is actually trying to create this habit of sort of, I guess, mindfulness when I'm with my children, to actually be present with them rather than thinking about the story I have to work on or what edits I need to do. Because we know that actually mental habits are the most powerful and most important, but they're the hardest to diagnose the cue and the reward because they happen so fast and they're so ephemeral. But once you do, you can change your life.
Charles, that was great. Thanks for coming to talk to us.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Good luck.
Thanks.